is on the State Assembly website. All electronic devices, including mobile phones, please could you switch to silent. I would like to ask any members of the public who have joined us in the room today to not interfere in the proceedings, and as soon as the hearing's closed, please leave quietly. And for the purpose of the recording and transcript, I'd be grateful everyone who could speak to ensure they state their name and their role. And for this, then, I'd like to make the introductions. So my name is Deputy Hilary Jearn, and I'm the chair of this panel.
Deputy Tom Coles, Vice Chair.
Deputy Alex Curtis, panel member.
David Johnson, Constable St Mary, panel member.
Deputy Steve Luce, I'm Minister for the Environment.
Mike Jackson, Constable St Bernard's Assistant Minister.
Kelly Whitehead, Group Director for Regulation.
Louise Magris, Director for Housing, Environment and Placemaking.
Kevin Pilley, Head of Place and Special Plan.
Thank you very much. And we have 2 hours to have this hearing. We have lots and lots of questions to ask you, Minister. But of course, if there is anything that we would like to follow up, of course, we'll be doing that in writing after the hearing. But with 2 hours, hopefully we can get through as many as possible. And the first we'd like to focus in on is the proposed budget for 2025 to 2028. And so before we actually go into the details of some of the budget areas, please could you tell us if you are confident that there is sufficient funding allocated in the budget, proposed budget, to achieve the actions identified in delivering the priorities set out in the Common Strategic Policy under your ministerial remit?
Thank you, Chair. Well, there's no doubt that 2025, 2026 are moving forward. There's unsurprisingly pressures on government spend, and we as a government, I'm sure as the States Assembly as well, will want to spend taxpayers' money as wisely as we possibly can. We're looking at ways of making sure we're as efficient as we can be, and we have made some commitments in this government session, which is quite a short government session, 2 years, to do what we can to reduce expenditure and to be as efficient as possible. So we have had to prioritise, and we've had to do that in a number of ways, and one is to look at the art of the possible, which means we're looking very carefully at what we're intending to do and whether we have time to actually do that. And then we're looking very carefully at the amount of money we have available in order to do what we would like to do and whether we can do that as well. And along with legislative time, which again is another finite resource, we need to make sure that the things we intend to do, we have the time available with law drafting in order to do that work. And all these prioritisations have taken some time and some thought, but I am confident that in 2025, certainly, the prioritised list that we have come up with is funded, but I can't pretend it's not tight. I can't pretend that hasn't happened without some challenges. Obviously, you will know about recruitment and the way we're dealing with consultants that we've historically used in the past, and the fact that we're not using consultants from now on, and the fact that we're not replacing staff where vacancies might be taken out is an issue, and it's a resource issue across government and not just for my department. But I am confident that in 2025 we have allocated resources enough to do the work we want to do. But I can't say that it's not going to come without a challenge, and it will be difficult. And throughout the year, I am sure that other challenges will appear, because what happens is when you say, this is the amount of work that we have to do, we've just got time, we've just got about the right amount of money and the resource and staff to do it, I'd have to say there's very little contingency in that, if you like. And if something comes out of the woodwork in the middle of next year, which becomes immediately a priority, stuff will fall off the list of things that we would want to do, because it may be that we don't have the staff or we don't have the money without taking something else off. Because we are now in that point where we know what we want to do, just enough money, just enough time, just enough law drafting time to do all these things. But if something new appears, that list will have to be revisited. So the answer is, yes, I'm confident, but it's very tight. I don't know if Louise, you want to say anything more about money?
No, I'm happy with, I think.
Well, we've got lots more questions. We've got lots more questions on this. And Minister, did you request to receive more funding in the financial envelope when it was allocated to your department? Was there discussions? Did you request more to be able to cover the CSP priorities and the areas that you want to focus on?
We've certainly made some requests, maybe not specifically for money, but we've certainly put in applications to a process to apply for exemptions from, for example, consultancies. And quite rightly, some requests for consultants have been granted where the application is extremely technical. And it would be very surprising if government within their ranks of the civil service had people who were qualified to answer. And I can't think off the top of my head, but a particularly technical subject. But there's no doubt in other aspects we've applied for some additional funds or exemptions to employ consultants, and that's not been forthcoming. And we accept that that process has been very rigid, and it's been in line with our government statement that we will stop within, apart from the exceptional circumstances, the use of consultants. So we did make applications. I can't think we specifically applied for more money. Yes, I would have loved to have a lot more money, but what we've done is, as a government, we've said we're going to make these reductions, and I've agreed that we're going to do some targeting of, I've got the numbers here, 200,000 value for money, and we're going to save nearly £500,000 on employment, where we've had to look very hard at our staff levels, and we've come up with some solutions which aren't what we would like particularly, but we're taking some small staff reductions in order to meet the challenges of reducing the budget, because as a government we have committed to reduce our expenditure, and my department, like all others, have gone along with that, and for the greater good we are doing our bit. But as a bit like your first question, it's challenging, and we accept that, and we are knuckling down and getting on with finding a way through the challenges.
Minister, is it worth making it clear to the panel that there was no growth bid process for 2025? So there was no actual process to be able to bid for additional funds that members might have been familiar with in previous years?
Well, that's the reason we didn't apply for any more money, because we weren't going to be allowed to. So we, across the board, we've said no growth. And on top of that, we've had further challenges with being challenged to save money with expenditure.
And understood. And within that, because of course you were talking about that kind of applying for exemptions from very technical consultants or expertise that potentially are not sitting within the current staff, your current staff. But what extent do you believe that the Council of Ministers understand the balance between the natural environment and the built environment? And is this reflected in the budget? Do you feel that there is a balance and that the Council of Ministers understands that?
Well, the challenges have gone across the board within my department, and in some areas it's been easier to cope with, and in Kelly's area in regulation, obviously there's a lot of income. I mean, we have, I'm trying to think, income is £6 million to the department. The vast majority of that comes through regulation. So in Kelly's stream of work, if you like, in her department, it's much easier to cope with because there's money coming in. In natural environment, so you're talking about the built environment and the natural environment. Let's just, for the sake of this discussion, say regulation copes with built environment, and the Environment Department, Howard Davis Farm, does very much more than natural environment. They have very much reduced amount of income coming into the department, so there's a lot more challenging when it comes to their side, because they don't have the income coming in. They rely entirely on funds that are given to them in order to run that department. And I think the point I'm making is, where you have charges, yes, this government has committed very heavily to increasing charges to the smallest amount possible, but still you have the ability to create income which allows you to run your department. And okay, yes, there's government funds that go into help running that department as well. But in the natural environment side, there isn't the income to help with how you might balance that, balance the finances. So in some ways, it's been more challenging for natural environment than built environment. But that's only because of the income streams.
Thank you.
Yes,
Councillor.
sorry, the Chair's question distinguished between natural environment and built environment is another, a further tier in the fact that environmental health seems to become an increasing part of your portfolio. Are you concerned about its growth in respect of your responsibilities?
And when you say growth, Constable, could you just elaborate? When you say growth, am I concerned because the pressures on environmental health are increasing?
No, because it seems to me that environmental health issues are coming more to the fore or being brought more into your portfolio, or do you disagree with that?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, environmental health falls under, the regulation, if you like. No, maybe not regulation, it's environmental health. But the society we live in is regulating more. Health is becoming more important. We're looking all the time. The more you find, the more answers you get, the more challenges you have, the more you have to regulate, if you like. And we're seeing this very much with food. And I'm thinking about allergens. We've got some work coming down the line next year, working to make sure that labelling is done correctly. But it's never quite as simple as it seems on the tin. And it's not just labelling, it's the way kitchens operate, it's the way restaurants operate, it's the way food is imported onto it's very complex. And environmental health is no different. It's becoming more.
Okay, now your concern really is your budget for that, because it seems to be, there has been increasing your portfolio over the years, and I'm never been too convinced that the budget has gone with it.
Well, maybe Kelly might have some views on whether the budget meets. I mean, we do have in regulation the ability, as I said, I wouldn't say it gets moved around all over the place, but as a department it comes in and we use it to the best of our ability.
Absolutely. In terms of the legislation profile for environmental health, as it was known as a previous department, and now Environment Consumer Protection, the laws have always been within the Minister for Environment's remit. So there hasn't been an expanding of laws or legislation around environmental health in terms of the Environment Minister's portfolio. In terms of staff resources, we had a significant recruitment drive in sort of early 2022. So the staffing numbers that in terms of the roles that we have are sufficient to manage the introduction of licensing in several areas, which is effectively a new element of regulation. What is exceptionally important in a regulatory context is essentially a cost-neutral position to general taxation, and the reason for fees and charges that the States Assembly approve when they introduce new legislation is to enable charging mechanisms for an element of cost recovery. As the Minister described, regulation is not cost recovered, so we do draw on general taxation as part of our budget.
Yeah, sorry to intervene.
No, and it's an interesting, Minister, about the fact that, you've said about the income versus natural environment is very difficult because it doesn't generate income, and I think it's something to reflect on. And is that a general kind of modus that the Council of Ministers have looked at the budget overall, of kind of like the spaces where extra income is kind of able to generate, that kind of has a little bit more of a supportive bubble around it versus those areas like natural environment that has, of course, a value, but it has a value that is obviously not able to necessarily.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying, because the natural environment obviously has a massive value to the islanders and to the island, in keeping our countryside and our natural environment beautiful and somewhere we can all enjoy is massively important, but it comes at a cost, because you can't charge people for the enjoyment of going out into the countryside. But certainly within the department, we're not that rigid that we can't help each other. Obviously, we all work together for a greater good here, and it may well be that there's instances where some of the income that comes into regulation may be under the department banner, be it though they may be in a position to help. And when it comes to balancing budgets, certainly when it comes to putting in our bid putting in our numbers to the government budget, it's under the heading of environment. And So consequently, what we do with it below is very much up to us. But I just go back to the commitment that the government has given. And another one of the challenges we all have is, on one hand, we commit to increasing fees, charges, whatever they are, to a very small amount of money, probably much less than RPI. And at the same time, trying to provide more services to the public of the island. And the introduction of new charges then gives us a challenge, because on one hand, we don't want to be increasing the cost of living by increasing the charges we already have. And then we come along and say, oh, actually, in addition, we're now trying to provide all these services as well. Surely some of these must be chargeable. And then trying to challenge ourselves as to whether the impacts of increasing or starting some new charges, what the effect will be on the general public, on the taxpayer, and on the cost of living. But people demand more regulation because they want to make sure we're safe. We provide more services, and the principle of charging for services is something we have to do, because it's unfair on the normal taxpayer if person A is asking for something and person B isn't. Why should both of them suffer equally when only one is benefiting? So the one that's asking for the service should be contributing something. So I think the principle of charging for services across the board is one we accept, and it may well be that moving forward that it's something that we have to add to, because new services are demanded and consequently are provided.
And Minister, you sent us a letter responding to some questions ahead of this hearing about the delivery plans and savings proposed in the budget. And for example, Paul's work stream is the prevention of pollution from construction sites. Do you think you could elaborate on the scale as how large this problem is, and what mechanisms are there to deal with this already? And I think this comes up in that discussion we've just had about the balance between the built and the natural environment, and the fact that this is going to be paused. Could you give the panel some understanding of that?
Yes, you're quite right. there was a list of subjects which we've had to pause while we've done our prioritisation work. And while contamination leaving construction sites is pollution leaving construction sites is something that we have paused. It wasn't on my radar as something that was particularly an issue, but obviously with climate change, and I mean yesterday was a classic example of a massive amount of rain falling in a small part of the island. Pollution leaving construction sites is something we need to think about. But Kelly, it wasn't that high up the importance that we felt it needed to stay on. It was one of those that came off. It will be dealt with in the future.
It was a piece of legislation that we had also targeted to go alongside an update to the statutory nuisances legislation. So both of those were going to be worked in parallel. So this was essentially a piece of legislation around nuisance and pollution, particularly around construction sites, noise, dust, odour, things like that. We do have controls already in place through the planning system, so in terms of construction management plans as conditions on planning permits, but this was essentially a different type of regulation, which was more of the statutory nuisance angle. We paused it because we were prioritising other legislation that we felt had more of a significant risk to health, particularly around food, building bylaws. But we do consider it an important piece of legislation that we do want to bring forward once those other legislations have come into effect.
And so how much work had been begun on it already, and what was the cost so far on that piece of working on that? Both, I guess, the statutory nuisance law and this specific one on pollution, if you're saying it should be together, how much work?
There was no external consultation costs, so it was only in-house resource. I think there was some development of policy intent a number of years ago, but it's not progressed any further to that. We did not go into consultation. So it was a very initial programme of work internally looking at possible changes and amendments. So in terms of the costs, it would have been staff costs on a previous year's budget.
And from your answer, I can deduce that you're saying that there is enough there in the different plans around construction sites to make the impact on the environment less? Is that correct?
And
or-
also on the impact on neighbours and human health. So we do have other controls that we can use.
I think, I mean, certainly the members on the planning committee will know, be aware, an application that comes in which is likely to create a lot of noise, a lot of disturbance for neighbours, depending on the type. I mean, there are always conditions these days that are put on planning applications, and quite often neighbours of applications will present themselves to the planning committee saying, I'm really concerned about the noise, I'm concerned about the dust. But there are additional restrictions being put on development all the time now to, you know, pollution just being one of them, but noise, dust, light, and of course we're also trying to move construction down the road of recycling. So we are aiming and very much hoping in some time in the future we will get to a point where there's no waste coming out of construction sites, because everything that's taken down is reused and, you know, skipped and put to somewhere where it can be recycled. So there's a lot of challenges for construction sites, but certainly pollution in its various shapes and forms is one that we will be on in the future.
And I suppose this, keeping to this, and something that you just mentioned, Minister, earlier about fees and income into the department, and the panel notes that the introduction to a development levy is another project that's been delayed. Can you explain why this is not being developed?
Well, development levies have been proposed in the past, and certainly I remember quite vividly the States debate where I took a development levy to the States back in 2016, 17, something like that, and it got thrown out comprehensively. It's a real challenge trying to...
But Minister, this has been agreed in the States Assembly. I think it was in this term, there's been a development levy proposition that was passed. I can't remember exactly.
Deputy Kovacs brought it.
Deputy Kovacs brought it and it was passed, so it actually has been agreed that there should be a development levy developed.
I accept that, and I was in discussions with ministers yesterday about other states' decisions which have had to be put into a prioritisation list. And I think we felt that despite the fact that the States Assembly had made this decision, and in my view quite rightly, we have to work on a basis here of the importance and significance of the work we're going to do between now and the next election. And also, I think it's fair to say that we need to take into account the difficulty, complexity of doing that work, and whether there's an appetite outside of the States Assembly for it. And we have seen in the past where States Assemblies have taken decisions on housing policy, for example, where the industry reacted in a way that actually stopped housing being built full stop, and we in a very short order had to go back on that. And at the moment, any additional levy on building...
It'll be on the land though, not, it will be on the
Oh,
land, on the sale.
Uplift in the
Uplift
well,
of the land.
What I was about to say applies the same. Any additional levy that's put on land building or whatever you like will have a knock-on effect somewhere in the pipeline. And as much
Though
as
it could have a knock-on effect the other way. For example, we have the field at Zion that was sold for a substantial amount of money, and they were supposed to be affordable housing, and it's been very difficult to be able to get that balance right, to be able to have affordable housing with with a developer who's had to or did pay a very expensive piece of land, way more than what it should potentially be.
I absolutely accept that, and maybe there is work to do in this area, but I think we need to remember that we also passed some sites in that same island plan debate for specific types of housing where the owners are refusing to sell because they won't make enough money. We can't oblige, unless we're going to go down a compulsory purchase road for housing, which I don't think would be a clever idea.
Well, Minister, that is in the Bridging Island plan, that is a legitimate scheme and a policy intention that if after 3 years of the commencement of the plan, sites do not come forward, that the policy is there to allow compulsory purchase. So it's not off the wall. That's written in the plan itself.
Well, it may well be, but it is, officers may have something to say about this, but it's always been my understanding that the states only compulsorily purchased land for safety or for health or something really, and not for housing.
Perhaps if I can pick up on both of those points, Minister, perhaps I'll deal with the compulsory purchase issue first, as Deputy Curtis mentioned. Deputy Curtis mentioned the plan does contain policy provision within it for sites that don't come forward to be considered for compulsory purchase, but clearly that would require further decision of the states to actually make that specific decision in relation to sites. Going back to the issue of the development levy, as the Minister said, there was work undertaken under the Minister's previous tenure as Environment Minister to consider the introduction of, it was called the Jersey Infrastructure Levy at that time. And there was a considerable amount of work that was undertaken before that proposition was brought to the Assembly, where work had to be undertaken to basically assess whether the value of development in Jersey was sufficient to be able to render a levy viable. So there's a considerable amount of work undertaken to do that, and all of that material is available online. That was undertaken in 2017, I think, and we had to engage consultants to support us in doing that work. So that was to test the sort of economics, if you like, of viability of some form of levy. In addition to that, we would also have to bring in some form of vehicle, probably some new legislation to enable a levy to actually work in Jersey. So whilst, as you've noted, there have been 2 States Assembly decisions to explore this issue, both in terms of the approval of the Island Plan, where it's a proposal to explore the establishment of what's called a Sustainable Communities Fund, funded by some sort of levy, and then Deputy Kovac's proposition, which effectively reaffirmed that decision. What's required to be undertaken to inform that work is quite a considerable exercise. We did submit a bid in the last government plan round for some work for that, for some resources to undertake that, and that wasn't supported. So as it currently stands, we don't have the resource or the ability to undertake that significant piece of preliminary work that's required to look at the introduction of a levy.
And so has there been any work done on how much financial loss is being incurred by not introducing this levy? So, and do you think it would have been prudent to create an estimate of gains from this, so to help with that decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite difficult in the sense that, clearly there are issues around, first of all, is a levy viable? If it's viable, what form of development is it viable on? Is it viable on residential development? Is it viable on commercial development? On what sort of basis are you going to charge the levy? What's the rate going to be? So it's very difficult to second guess all of those issues without doing all of that preliminary work.
Okay, so thank you. So we know that work then is being put on hold for now to even understand and answer those kind of questions. In the letter, Minister, moving on, you haven't listed any works that have been cancelled. Is this the case? Most of the work that you have put on hold, that is to be picked up, and will that be picked up within 2026, or it's really for very much when we talk about it should come, we are talking about in the next term of a government, or even further, depending?
I think it's probably in the letter when the word consideration comes, and the pause projects will be reconsidered for 2026. But I think it's fair to say that some of those on that list will not be done before the next election, and will need to be brought back to whoever the minister is after the next election to see how they feel about picking it up and moving on again. I mean, some of this work will be paused waiting for other work to be done. Carbon offset purchasing strategy is one, for example, which I feel that we're probably going to need to wait a little bit longer to see how things develop. Purchasing carbon offsets is quite a challenging subject for some. We don't know whether it works. We don't. Is the principle right? You know, paying somebody else to do something that you should be doing yourself. It's a whole. So there's one example there, and I would imagine the carbon offset purchasing may be one that be left.
I think where we're more focusing in on, Minister, is in June. The panel sent you a letter about an update on the Bridging Island plan proposals, for example, and all the different elements. There is 40 proposals there, I think, and we were sent an update in different colours about how far has those different things been progressed. And of course it's...
And responsible for lots of these pieces of policy. But yes, there's a list of requirements in the last Bridging Island Plan, which says before we get to the next one, the next debate, there's a number of things that need to be done. I'm trying to think of the percentages, but not quite bought. A third have been, a third are in train, and a third are yet to be started. But for me, I think work on the strategies, work and things that are needed for the next Island Plan debate are, I would sort of say, a bit of a business as usual, in as much as I expect that they're being done in the background, and we know they've got to be done. It's not something we can stop, because the next Island Plan debate is coming down the line at us. I mean, there's no date for it yet, but it's clear that this was a Bridging Island Plan that was supposed to come to an end next year, 25-26. It's clearly not going to do that, but we can't take our foot off the pedal and not be continuing to prepare for the next Island Plan debate, which is going to be, to my mind, a really important one. But Kevin, could you just update us on where we are with those pieces of work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Minister. Yeah, as the Minister said, you know, the proposals in the plan are, they essentially fall into two categories. Some of the proposals in the plan are there to assist the implementation of the current plan, so things like preparation of supplementary planning guidance, to support the implementation and application of some of the policies in the plan. And some of that work is taken, as the Minister said, as usual by my team. Other elements in there are being led by other parts of government, so they're not all planning focused, but they do have a planning relationship. So we're working with colleagues across government to deliver some of those. And then, as the Minister said, some of the proposals are really about undertaking some of the evidence-based work that we need to inform the next Island Plan. You know, clearly one of the things that the Minister's highlighted as being critically important in that is the question of a water strategy, and addressing the critical question of how the island is going to address the challenges around having a robust water supply. So, and the Minister's seeking to progress that piece of work, for example. So. It's difficult for me to give you an update on all of the 40 proposals.
I think it's more because the only thing that really is mentioned here is that pause projects would be the St Brelade's Bay Improvement Plan. So the question, I suppose, from the panel is what's going on? If it's business as usual, why is that specifically being highlighted as paused? I assume then that everything else is carrying on, and then what is taking the place of that's been paused?
Well, I think if you look at the St Brelade's Bay Improvement Plan, that was subject to a timeline in the proposal in the plan. So we can be very clear about that in the sense that timeline isn't going to be met. Some of the proposals in the plan would require the engagement of external support, because we don't either have the capacity or the skill set within my team or within government to do that work. So I've just talked about the Sustainable Communities Fund. That's one of those projects where we would need to secure some expert advice about that, about the evidence needed to support that piece of work. So,
and would you be able to get that on the current criteria about consultants and the technical? Like, I don't know what the criteria is for how much to define what technical expertise is needed for a consultant? Do you for accept that piece of work?
We haven't looked at that against the criteria that are currently established, but as I said earlier, there are essentially two parts to that piece of work. One is around the sort of surveying and economic expertise around the viability of development costs, and then the other is around a policy mechanism about developing a new tool, whether that's policy or law required to deliver that piece of work. So, we would need to look at both of those elements relative to the existing criteria, but clearly that would also require financial resource for that work to be commissioned.
And if you want to talk about St Bellard's Bay specifically, I mean, Deputy Scott, as we know, is a great proposer of this particular piece of work, and she's the one that's championed it. I spoke to her when we considered putting it on the pause list. Obviously, she was disappointed. I'm disappointed as well. But one thing, we can look back to the most recent Bridging Island Plan debate, and the constable sitting alongside me had a lot of input into that debate when it specifically came to St Bellard's Bay. And one thing we can say, and okay, it's not a get out if you like, but there were some specific amendments which came forward and were won by the constable appertaining to St Bellard's Bay. So additional protection was put in. It's not, an improvement plan, a large document, but at least we're cognizant of the challenges at St Bellard's. And I don't know, Constable, do you want to just...
I don't think it's necessarily about St Bellard's. I think it was more specifically, though that's obviously important for that. What is that wider list and understanding? I think your prioritisation, Minister, on what you needed to do, and when you said that there's the business as usual work carrying on in putting these proposals from the Bridging Island Plan into play, and then of course it being very specific on this. But I think understanding that there is a specific deadline with that, where the others don't have particularly a time frame. Well, so my question to you, Minister, then is, do you think that all these proposals should be, and all these elements within the Bridging Island Plan should be completed prior to drafting any island plan in the future? And do you think that we'd be able to get there?
Well, I think, Kevin will correct me, I think they have to be done before the next island plan debate, don't they?
Well, as I say, some of the proposals in there are about collating the evidence to address the challenges that the island's got and that have some planning manifestation. So things like, I've referred to it already, but the work around the water strategy is critical, because we know from the evidence that was presented during the Bridging Island Plan that if there is a challenging summer, then the island's got we've got a challenge now in terms of the capacity of our existing water resources. So clearly, that's likely to become more of an issue in the future. So I think that's one issue, a critical issue that needs to be addressed by the island plan, because if there is a land use requirement arising from the need to enhance our ability to provide more water resources for the island, then the plan really ought to address that. Otherwise, we end up with a situation where if the plan doesn't address that, we may get a planning application for some form of development that isn't recognised in the plan. And we all know where that ends up when you look at the situation with the hospital, when that wasn't in the plan. So
we're lucky and unlucky with the next island plan debate, in as much as obviously it was due after the Bridging Island Plan to be in 2026. Island plans generally are very focused on housing requirement. One of the main reasons that we have an island plan is to identify sites for housing. And I think it's fair to say that had the need for more housing continued in the way we thought it was going to be when we were developing the island plan and where we thought we were going, the requirement to have this next island plan debate would have been much greater than it has been. And it's because, unfortunately, because I personally feel that a growing population is something that we need on the island in order to do a whole load of things. But because the population seems to have plateaued at the moment, we now know that the Bridging Island Plan identifies enough housing sites for at least 2 or 3 years before we start to see a requirement coming forward, a need coming forward, which will be over and above the sites that we've identified in the Bridging Island plan. So there's pros and cons. The fact that we're not desperately in need of more housing sites at the moment means that we do have a bit more time, but we can't take our foot off the pedal. The next island plan will need those pieces of work to be done, which is why it's a bit business as usual. And I'm sure that Louise and Kevin are progressing those 40 pieces of work where they have time, money, resource and staff. But we're under no illusion that on all those headings, it's challenging.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Minister. And I think, our next focus of questions were really about the fact of the role reductions in the sense that not hiring those roles that are becoming vacant, and then also for reduction in consultancy budget. And though we've covered a lot of ground already on those, we're already identified a few areas, and I think we will continue to through our questioning of, it's technical. A lot of the areas that your portfolio covers is quite technical, and really the panel wants to understand that we would be understand if the team is your team has the expertise within it to be able to deliver all these different elements that for this longer term need for an island plan. At some point we can't keep putting it off. It does need to come to fruition. There are a number of under the delivery of the key common strategic priorities, even around, for example, the carbon neutral roadmap. There are elements that are needing technical expertise, and we just want to understand, Minister, that the criteria that's been put in place on being able to get exemptions understands the need for that technical expertise in the level of work that is required under your portfolio, I think.
Well, we do have, I do have a number of areas under my portfolio where some very technical work will need to be done in the future, and Kevin's mentioned water. Certainly that will be one area where I think we will need some additional help. And I'm thinking, we have had to change the way we're running our wind farm project, for example, where we had a number of experts employed on a consultancy basis to help us with that work. We have reprioritised our staff within the civil service to allow us to continue that work, but I can't say that it hasn't slowed us down a little bit, because obviously changing staff halfway through a project never speeds things up, but we have in-house resource which is going to help us to do that. But there will be always some technical areas where we will need to employ people, and it is a challenge. There's no doubt about that. We have been challenged to come up with some real tough criteria to give reasons why some of these technical people are justified in employment.
And do you think there's a risk to not have that oversight from very technically specialist people?
There certainly would be a risk if we're not going to be allowed to employ them. But on wind, for example, we're out to tender at the moment for procurement for our experts in some areas of the wind farm project. And if for a reason we would not be allowed to employ that person, that would certainly be would leave an area of the project without the right sort of input, because obviously as an island, we've never built a wind farm before. We're never going to build one again. This is a one-off project which will need some very specialist people who we quite rightly don't have working for us in-house. So we'll need to employ them, and I'm hoping that we've got permission to employ those, and that's right. Well,
Would you like me to add a little bit on that? Because I think that's a good example of the technical expertise piece. So I think where the wind farms are quite an informative example, actually. So we have used consultancy expertise for sort of two reasons in the past. Number one would be for very technical pieces. So, for example, water flow modelling to underpin the water strategy would be a super example of something that we're very unlikely to have in-house. We have also employed consultancy as surge capacity, so basically additional policy officers, if you like. And the wind project, you'll recall, because of course you were part of it at the beginning, Deputy, we had surge capacity to help us take on this extra growth work that the Assembly and ministers felt were very important. Where we have changed, where this government has thought hard about where it would like to use its consultancy budgets, it's suggesting that we shouldn't be using them for surge capacity people, we should be developing people from within and prioritising for projects within the civil service and the skills that we have. So the wind project, where we're ramping out our surge capacity consultants, they're handing over to a new internal team. So we have some new people that have come over to my team in particular. They have extensive policy development skills. They're good, seasoned professionals, and I'm very, very happy to have them in my team. And they're picking up that what was previously held by surge capacity. So that's an example of losing surge capacity and saving that expenditure and developing internal talent. However, as the Minister rightly said, there's also some really technical pieces in the wind work. So a good example would be the strategic options appraisal, which looks at the very technical way you may and may not build a wind farm and what the cost-benefit analysis of that might be. That's not work my team can do, none of us could, it's very, very specialist, and that's an example of something that we do have permission to go out and get technical additionality on, and that's out. There's an ITT. I left a team of people looking at an awful lot of tenders before I came here, and we're evaluating that in the way that we always would have done. So I think it's about as well recognising where we're using surge capacity and technical expertise.
But just getting back to strategic level, employing consultants, paused work and all that type of thing. If we have 100 people in the civil service and we want to do 100 things, that's fine. Let's say we can cope with that. If as a minister I say, well, I want to do more and I want to continue to do some of this work that's on the pause list, it's been fine up till now because we've said, right, we've got 100 people here, but if we employ some consultants, they become additional resource, they allow us to do more work. But if we decide as a government we've got to cut down on our expenditure and we decide that consultancy is something we're not going to spend money on, we have to accept that our ability to do 120 pieces of work reduces back to 100, and we only have the civil servants and some very specific technical consultancy that we can draw on. So the downside of saying we're going to spend less money is that we actually, unfortunately, can only do a certain amount. We do less work. So our aspirational list for what we might like to do between now and the next election has to be reprioritised. And that's
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah.
Thank you, Minister. And just last few questions on the budget. The states have already Assembly approved a freeze on fuel duty, and once again in the draft budget for 2025, the fuel duties have been proposed to be frozen. When, of course, there is the element of some of that fuel duty goes in towards the Climate Emergency Fund. So could you provide a brief description of the impact this freeze will have on the Climate Emergency Fund?
Well, we're going to continue. The important thing from the Climate Emergency Fund perspective is that we're going to continue to have our 9p. So that's good in some ways.
Yep.
As a Minister for the Environment, I would like to see government initiatives, if you like, to focus people's attention on burning, carbon. And obviously, in some ways, it's disappointing that we have chosen to freeze fuel duty. But in other ways, when we're trying to help islanders and taxpayers with the cost of living, that's not a surprise. So this was a discussion that we had around the Council of Ministers table, as you may well, you might not be surprised. And as Environment Minister, there was a case to be made for trying to encourage people away from carbon fuels. And one of those is obviously the duty element. But as a government, we decided we were going to help the taxpayer, keep cost of living down and reduce that duty. But from my personal perspective in the Climate Emergency Fund, it was vital that that money continued to come in, and it is going to come in. We'd like more. We put our case, but the agreement around the tables, this is what we were going to do in the immediate short term with fuel duty. We will be criticised whatever we do. If we don't increase it, those that want to save carbon will be unhappy. If we do increase it, those that want to burn carbon will be unhappy. I think we've probably got a balance between the two, but certainly from Carbon Emergency Fund, as you said, there's no change. So that was good, because that's an important source of income to our fund, which then allows us to go out and encourage people to save carbon in other directions.
And that leads me to Deputy Coles, who will actually now focus on the carbon neutral roadmap. So thank you, Mr.
Thank you. As the panel notes within your letter responding to the panel's questions regards to the delivery plans and saving proposals from the 25-28 budget, although the climate change is a priority, there are a number of policy areas that will be paused that come from the carbon neutral roadmap. Can you say what activities will be delivered, commenced or continued in 2025 as agreed within the carbon neutral roadmap?
Louise, this is firmly your...
So sorry, the question was what will be carried on?
Delivered,
Yes.
commenced and continued. So.
Yeah. So we do intend to continue delivering what the roadmap says that we will deliver, bar the things that are mentioned. I think probably a couple of things to reflect upon is the biggest area of focus we think going forward is going to be around the low carbon heating incentive. So you'll be aware that the grant incentives to help electric vehicles have been very popular, and we're almost, you'll have perhaps seen the press release that we're almost at the end of the budget allocation for that particular initiative. So that has completed and will come to an end. I think where there is possibly more complexity has been around changing people's heating systems. And that's something that we've underachieved on against our objectives. We've got about 350 applications in, and we hope to have 1,000 done by the end of 25, and it's unlikely we're going to do 600 next year at the current rate.
That was a challenge, actually, because as Minister I came in, as you will know, I decided to push back the banning of replacement of boilers. We wanted more discussion with the industry. Certainly, when you look at the numbers and the number of boilers to be replaced, the number of years available, the number of boilers per year that need to be done, and the ability of the industry to cope with that, there's a lot more work to do, and we're working with the industry to try to encourage them to get their staff up to speed to do that work. The money that we are giving out for boiler replacements, we've obviously got flow boilers and we've got heat exchangers. What we're finding is that people are tending to go for the cheaper capital cost at the beginning, but actually leads them to increased maintenance and costs, running costs into the future. And I'm certainly going to be looking at ways that we might encourage them to go for the more expensive option at the outset, which is much easier and cheaper to run and better for the future. And of course, the other thing we're doing is reprioritising our work about the review of the building bylaws, because I felt that getting that document back up to where it needs to be would then inform the certificates that we put on pause, and I'm trying to think of the other thing that we put on pause. But I certainly felt the building bylaw review is really important, and once that was set, that gave us the guidelines, if you like, which then allows us to inform the other parts of the carbon work that we need to do in that particular area. How's the bylaw review getting on, Kelly?
So we have vetted the project, we engaged, had a really successful at the Sustainable Construction Summit workshop with industry stakeholders about areas that they would like to see prioritised, and we're hoping that that sort of initial policy consideration will come out in Q1 2025.
Can you confirm if there are any agreed carbon neutral roadmap budget lines that will be transferred between headings?
Not at the moment, I don't believe, no. No, we wouldn't be able to do that without the agreement of the Minister and quite potentially the states, depending on what they, the magnitudinal difference in that. So at the moment, the expenditure lines are as outlined in the carbon neutral roadmap. Obviously, the opportunity to rethink those and look at them again will come at the end of this delivery period. So, of course, you'll be familiar that the plan is that the Climate Council will be commissioned to have a look at our success or where we've missed our targets to date, and they will be an external a resource to help evaluate the success of the policies or otherwise, and then they will be able to help propose where our policy focus should be for the next delivery period. And at that point, we would look at refocusing the spend to meet those policy directions, and then of course then we would have to rebase that budget and seek approval to do it in that way.
Okay, which will nicely leave.
It's not completely separated, but the fact that we've got a carbon emergency fund over here, it's not as
Yeah.
integrated as everything else is. So we're fortunate in a way that it is, we can't just dip in and out of it as we would see fit.
Yeah.
It's
And
there
even-
for a specific purpose, and that purpose is maintained.
Yeah, and even between the budget lines. So if, for example, we've got X amount of money for X incentives or X policy initiative, we don't tend to move those around because we shouldn't. We're sticking to the policies until we have a chance to evaluate them, check their success or otherwise, and then pivot.
Yeah.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, well, Lynn,
So I'm just clarifying on that, the initial incentive scheme for conversion of boilers, etc., is that the budget allocation is almost
No,
Complete.
that's ongoing.
it is ongoing.
That one's underspending. It was the
The
electric
one that's getting very close to finishing is the incentive for vehicles.
Okay.
And we know that we're now in the last
Aware of
10%
that,
of the
Yeah.
monies that we've got available. We've announced that that scheme will be closing. We expect that there may be a bit of a rush because there will only be a finite amount of grants that will be left to give out. And I have to say, I think it's been a great success. I think we're waiting for the climate report to tell us how much of a success it's been. In some ways, I'd like to know before that. And I'd also like to have some money to do some more work in that area, because actually direct substitution of internal combustion engine for electric is it's a win-win. It's not just reducing it slightly. It just goes from you're using carbon and you're not using carbon, and that's really good. I think Jersey's, although we don't have the data, my gut feeling is that Jersey's really done quite well with electric vehicles in the last couple of years. I'm sure the scheme has had something to do with it, but it would be nice to be able to continue in that work. What I did do was I found that the scheme for electric bikes, I wasn't happy was working as well as it should have done. We were only seeing, we were seeing less than a 30% redemption rate. So for every grant, for every 100 applications we approved, less than 30 of those people came forward and actually bought bikes. And I did say if this doesn't improve in the first few months while I'm Minister, I will look to repurpose that money somewhere else. It didn't improve, in fact, it was actually getting worse. So I said, right, we're going to take the small amount of cash, we're going to put it into electric vehicles, and I've specifically targeted small commercial vehicles. And instead of £3,500, the grant's £4,000. It will only do a small number of vehicles, but it's going to encourage business, small business who are thinking about replacing a van, white van man. Here's an opportunity to go for an electric van, and here's a government grant to help you do it. So again, I'm hoping we're going to replace some diesel or petrol vans, straight electric. But after that, the electric vehicle scheme will come to an end, but the boiler scheme continues.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. The boiler carries on there. Thank you.
Most certainly, and if I can just be really clear, so the beauty of the Climate Emergency Fund is because it is a constituted state fund, it rolls over. So if we have a particular budget line that's underspending, aka the boilers, then that will just roll forward. What the Minister isn't proposing to do is to, for example, take money out of the boiler line and put it towards more EVs, just because EVs are more popular. That would not be within the spirit of what was agreed by the Carbon Neutral Roadmap. When the EVs come to an end, they come to an end, and the Minister will rethink based on the evaluation, and then the boilers can just roll forward and we can put a big push on that and hopefully increase uptake.
Okay, thank you.
And if I could just, sorry, the Minister mentioned evaluation, and obviously that's a really important part of understanding the success of the work that's been undertaken or otherwise. And so we've just started an evaluation piece on the EV work. So we've done a massive a consultation with the people who redeemed electric vehicle grants to understand what they use the vehicle, what vehicle they purchased, what its usage habits are, all of those sorts of issues. So to understand, how that money was best spent on behalf of the taxpayer. So that will form part of the plan going forward as to whether that is a piece of work, a policy that would be continued or reinvented in some way in the future.
Thank you. Sorry, Tom.
You mentioned within your answer about the Climate Council. So has work commenced on setting this up?
That's on the books. It's not long, is it?
No.
The team are beginning to think about evaluating that because they have to be in place and ready to go for next year. So that work has begun in the background.
Okay. And what other areas of policy and legislation for the carbon neutral roadmap are in process for 2025?
What other pieces? Particularly around skills. So one of the things that we know is a problem in getting the heating system incentives out of the door is because the ability of the industry to fully respond to the demand from people, but also the amount of installers, the supply lines, all of those sorts of things that make heating system swaps easy and quick, which currently they kind of aren't. So we're working with Skills Jersey on the delivery of industry workshops, those sorts of things to help the wraparound matters that increase the uptake of the grant. So that's a really obvious piece that's underway. Well, we're liaising with Highlands about heating system designs and installation, heat pump installation courses, those kind of matters. So focusing on green skills is part of the background work that's going on this year as well. That's important.
There's also evaluation that's going to be required on the latest electric potential for replacing oil-fired boilers. One of the challenges we have, as we know, we've got two major challenges in carbon replacement. We've got transport and we've got housing. And we know in the housing that historically it's been very difficult to find an electric boiler to replace an oil-fired boiler to heat an old Jersey property, granite property, for example. But there's two things that we need to be looking at. The first one is that the latest generation of electric boilers, which I'm told are very much more on par with the output, thermal output of an oil-fired boiler. And the other one is I want to do more work on not necessarily replacing oil boilers with electric, but oil boilers with, or just converting that boiler into a vegetable oil burning rather than carbon oil. So there's lots of work going on there. Both pieces of work will lead to no carbon, but I want to investigate the alternative for using liquid fuel as opposed to electricity. But that's important work that's going on as well.
Thank you. Within the budget, the panel notes that the 25-28 closing balances for the CEF include the sum of 1.2 million of investment in non-current assets relating to sustainable transport policies. The sum will be appropriately transferred from the CEF in future years. The fund's cash balance, including these non-current assets, will be presented separately. Can you elaborate on the rationale behind utilising the climate emergency funds to fund sustainable transport policies and not other projects or policies?
Yep. Very happy to do that.
Yeah, please.
Are you happy for me to set that on, Minister? So when the Climate Emergency Fund was set up, there was a period of time between the fund accumulating income and the agreement of the carbon neutral roadmap. So essentially there was some money sitting there waiting to be used for policies that hadn't yet been agreed. So there was some work done and amendments put by states members in subsequent government plan for 2 to 3 years before the carbon neutral roadmap was agreed. And some of that was agreed for Strong Start Sustainable Transport Initiative. So those were states' decisions that were agreed to use Climate Emergency Fund money for STP outcomes. So those are capital projects, as I'm sure you're aware. They quite often take a while to get going and then to deliver and then to be deployed and all of that. And some of those projects have delivered capital assets. So they're accounted for separately, as you've seen in the fund, but they were the result of a state's decision to use the Climate Emergency Fund for STP outcomes.
And can you explain what is meant by the statement that this sum will be appropriately transferred from the Climate Emergency Fund in future years?
It means it's an accounting anomaly. I shouldn't have used that word because I can never say it. It's just an accounting term. So what we'll do is, it is confusing having it sitting there because what it is doing is representing a capital balance. So it will be moved back to the department that will be maintaining that capital asset. So for example, if it's a cycle track or, I don't know, a bus shelter or a mobility hub or something a bit like that, that will be transferred back to the I&E capital areas and those teams that maintain that asset. So that money won't be reported against the fund. It'll go back to the managing department.
Okay. What work has been completed in 2024 around the financing strategy post-2026? What is planned for 2025? And what do you as Minister for the Environment hope to deliver?
The financing strategy in which regard?
Long-term financing strategy, I think.
For carbon? Yeah, okay. It's won't be a surprise that the long-term strategy is going to be a challenge. We know, I think everybody around this table will know, the Chairman especially, how much money we're going to need to put into carbon, climate change, however you want to describe it. And we know that we haven't got much time to come up with a strategy, but I have to say at the moment that work is not really hugely advanced, but it will be.
Yeah.
Louise, you want to add a bit more to that? But
Yeah.
we know the numbers are going to be very big, and we will have to find a way to do that.
So that's absolutely right. It is a challenge, and it's a challenge for this government to take on board the entirety of the financing envelope all the way to net zero at 2050. So the task has been broken down into smaller chunks. We've started some work on what we think the delivery profile will look like for policies in the next delivery term and what the financing of that will be. And what it's also doing is looking at the fund. It's more about taking smaller bites.
It's all about having a plan for a plan.
Yeah,
You know, in a sort
and
of
responsive to the delivery.
Question would be, Minister, obviously yourself and myself as a predecessor are lucky to have the Climate Emergency Fund to be able to deliver the carbon neutral roadmap. At the end of your term in 2026, would you feel that you have set up the future minister who will be delivering the carbon neutral roadmap with that same amount of funds, or being able to do that delivery into the future as successful as you've just been describing it now? Would you be confident that you're handing it over to the next term of government in that same capacity?
We haven't got long before we have to hand over, and I think the best I could hope for would be to have a plan for the next minister to take forward. So I've set it all out in front of them, whoever they are, and say this is the works you're going to have to do. This is roughly this is the work you're going to have to do to calculate how much money you're going to need. These are some options as to how you might raise that money, and Louise has mentioned already a few options that we're thinking about. But I don't think there's time for me to come up with, between now and the middle of 2026, with a plan that's going to show how we're going to fund this right the way out to 2050.
I don't think it was about 2050. It's mainly really if the next term, in the next 4 years, would there be a pot of money to be able to implement the next stage of the carbon neutral roadmap from the middle of 2026 onward for that next term of money? Would the next minister have the same, I suppose, luxuries?
At the moment, I don't have any. I don't have it in my mind that we're coming up with an additional new pot of money. That's not been mentioned. It may well be that when we get to mid next year, late next year, we have to start thinking about it. But we're not. I'm certainly not at the moment looking to go anywhere to ask the Treasury to find large pots of money to fund 26 to 30, which is going to be the phase 2. report. Obviously, we have money coming into the fund every year, but if the sort of things we're going to have to do will require more money than that as well. We had a really good start, as you know, Chair, with a large amount of money in the pot, which we've been slowly working our way through. We top up the fund, but we know as we complete the low-hanging fruit projects, which are easy to do and deliver us a reduction in carbon for a reasonable amount of money, we're going to have to spend more for smaller increments. It's going to get more and more difficult as we get closer to the target, and we are going to need money and strategies and policies to do that.
It might be worth adding that the absolute minimum, I suppose, is the continual income from the 9p a litre from the fuel duty. You'll remember that it was envisaged that there would be an escalator of 2p a year added on, and that's been frozen for reasons that we all understand. But if that minimum of 9p a litre keeps coming in, I'm sure you'll be aware that as people convert out into electric vehicles or other sustainable forms of transport, or just even with more fuel efficient vehicles, we're selling less petrol. So the 9p a litre on less litres means that there's a diminishing income coming into the fund, and you'll realise that that's a challenge as well. So naturally, part of the work that Treasury colleagues will have to consider going forward is the replacement of fuel duty as the profile of the fleet changes. So I know that work has begun in that space, although they too, like us, have to do some prioritisation exercises. So a replacement for fuel duty for general revenue purposes, as well as for the 9p litre of the fund, is also quite critical to make sure that at least the roughly £4 million a year that's coming into the fund to fund the base load of policies is critical. And if the fuel duty escalator were to be reintroduced at any point, then obviously that would be helpful.
Well, I think the escalator is important, and certainly I think after we get over this short-term hold, if you like, certainly 2025 government are committed to try to keep the cost of living down and reduce increases on the taxpayer. Once we get out of that period, as a department, as a minister, I'll certainly be fighting for that escalator to go in, because as Louise says, we know that the sales of petrol and diesel are reducing. That means if we maintain 9p a litre, our income is going to reduce. We need to try to, at the very least, maintain that, hopefully increase it a bit. So the escalator is an important factor for us, really.
Minister.
So sort of my final question in this area, the most efficient fuel that we use is the fuel that we don't use. So given that the announcement of the JEC is increasing its tariff prices, can you please tell the panel what details you are doing to increase the energy efficiency of homes for islanders to help reduce their bills?
Well, the first thing we're doing, as we mentioned 15 minutes ago, is we're on a review of building bylaws. And that will bring us right up to speed with the latest insulation specifications. And our target, of course, is to, well, we're very close already, but we want homes, new homes, which don't cost a lot of money to heat, and actually in many cases cost nothing to heat, because they are insulated so much that they won't need that. So I'm just trying to think back to, can you just remind me of the question again? Before I went off on a tangent on building bylaws.
So it's about increasing the efficiency of current homes as well. Is there any incentives planned or?
Well, past the bylaws, I guess that's the big one, because
But there is to remind the Minister, there's an energy efficiency component in the low heating system incentive as well. So in order for people to do a fuel switch, they need to look at the energy efficiency of their property, because your point is really well made. Even if they were to switch to a low carbon heating source, they should be using that energy they're using to the greatest efficiency. So there is a component on that. It is an area we and the Minister will remember from the first time he was Minister, the issue around energy efficiency in existing homes is a really difficult nut to crack, because it's often, not always, but it can be complex and invasive work to improve the energy efficiency of buildings. So that is
the historic housing stock is the challenge that we have. And certainly in the past, and I would hope into the future, where we've granted money or helped with extensions, and we've always said that a percentage of the value of that extension build has to be put into re-insulating the property that the extension's being attached to. And I think moving forward, that's something that we'll continue to have to work even harder on. Because it's all very well building a lovely extension to your home, which is beautifully insulated, if all the heat from the extension's going back into the house and disappearing. But the historic housing stock is a challenge and will continue to be a challenge, and we will do what we can to encourage people to insulate, to do all the things they can to stop the heat escaping, and then hopefully like that they can then move over to a different heating source, one that may not chuck out quite so much thermal capacity, but they won't need it because the house will be more insulated.
Thank you, Minister. And I think stepping into that wider energy is Deputy Curtis.
Thank you, and Minister, I will try and keep us to 15 minutes on this section, so other questions will be cut and we'll probably send those through in writing just because we've got a lot of topics. But on energy strategy, Minister, on the 3rd of June, the CNAG, Comptroller and Auditor General, published her report into critical infrastructure resilience, energy. And so from your department and your portfolio, could you provide a general overview as to the progress of addressing these issues found in the report?
Well, I mean, one of the things that the CNAG said was that, you know, maybe we should have an energy minister, and that certainly is of an interest to me. I think energy moving into the future is going to be critically important, along with water.
Have you
So
taken that to the Council of Ministers
I
yet?
haven't yet. I've mulled over it in my mind, and while I might be described as the minister with responsibility for energy, it's very clear doing work in the energy sector that there are a number of ministers around the table of Council of Ministers who have energy responsibilities for different reasons, whether that's emergency or economic. I mean, I see myself as the energy minister with a sort of an overview, if you like, without dealing with some of the specifics. But I would like to think that in the next government that it may be that energy is important enough that the next Chief Minister might consider that a proper specific energy minister with more responsibility in that direction would be something they could think about. Certainly the transition towards electricity is something that we have to continue to look at. We hope very much that electricity will continue to be extremely low carbon. We're fortunate at the moment that it is. But we do need to look at oil, we do need to look at gas, and if we're going to meet the targets that we have to meet, if we're going to do our bit to try to help with climate change, we've got to work really hard. And I think there are some challenges in the energy sector, and the CNAG is quite right.
Okay. We will. I think what we will do is we will ask a few questions on that report in writing.
Okay.
But one of the key findings is that government arrangements to assure the resilience of energy supply as both a community leader and a key customer are weak. And so specifically to that finding, are you undertaking work to address this?
Well, we're certainly looking at it, and obviously, as you say, the report's been issued, we've looked at it, and, you know, when we're told we're weak in a particular sector, it's incumbent upon us to go away and do some work in that area. I think it's clear that we have, as we all know, we have private companies responsible for electricity, responsible for gas, responsible for all our energy requirements, and government needs to be talking to these people and making sure that we have contingencies in place with them so that the population of the island can be assured that there's continued energy at any, regardless of which energy the population chooses. Obviously, we've had some challenges with gas recently. We know oil prices vary depending on global issues, and at the moment we have very serious challenges in the Middle East, which have come on the back of the Ukraine war, and that affects oil prices. And no matter how hard we try to insulate ourselves, the Jersey electricity price of buying electricity from the European grid is affected by what happens in other energy sources. And if the oil price goes up dramatically, that will affect the price of electricity. So
there's an interesting question there, because, Minister, you highlighted that there will be a delay and a slowing down on work on the wind farm project based on how the government is approaching consultancy. Yet at the same time, just like the development levy, there are opportunities to be weighed with cost and speed of movement. So one area of the wind farm is potentially to address energy sovereignty and resilience. And so how do you square up those kind of decisions? That's slow work.
You say there's a slowdown. I'd like to think that there won't be, there might be a gentle pause for a short period of time while we transit between consultants and in-house staff to do that. But we do have a timeline for the wind farm, and I'm very confident that we will be able to continue that timeline. We know that not far from now we will come to the State Assembly with the legislative framework, but we very much still hope that before the next election we come back to the State Assembly for a much bigger decision about how we move forward with the wind farm. I said during the original wind farm debate that, you know, we had a really good support. I know there were some sceptics asking questions about whether landing on Jersey was a requirement, whether those who felt, oh, we could lease the seabed out and just have a nice cheque drop into the exchequer. And you mentioned security, there's sustainability, there's affordability. All these things need to be mixed up and balanced. But the support in the Assembly for moving forward was quite, you know, was good. And I, as Minister, want to make sure that that support is there when we come with the next important decision, which is why we're working really, really hard to try to come back to the Assembly before the next election. Who knows where we are after the next election?
But just to capture what I think you said there, Minister, you don't foresee any delay to your original forecast timelines based on how you've changed your staffing profile.
Perhaps I can help.
Well, yeah. I can see where the deputy's going here.
I thought I heard
Still
that,
my
so
hope. There may be some slight changes in the timeline, but the target is to come back to the Assembly before the next election, and I'm confident that we can do that. I mean, at the end of the day, that is the important thing. Yep. There's the election, and we need that debate before we get there. How we get to that point may have to chop and change. It may have to slow down in some areas and speed up in others, but we have got a timeline. I don't know if you're
I think the Minister covered it. We're still aiming for that deadline. It's really important to the Minister and I think to the Assembly that we return within this term of government to set the position. And your point about the wind farm and the contribution it could make to energy security is an important part of the energy strategy, which I know you'd probably want to question me on, but we may move on.
We'll move on.
But exactly right. So this is an important part of the jigsaw that we need to close off in order to move forward with the other bits of work. So yeah, still aiming high.
Great.
And I think
we will.
No, I was just going to say, in as much as building bylaw review is really important to moving forward with other pieces of work which relate to it, the wind farm work is really important in regard to the energy strategy, because until we decide on the wind farm, it's going to be difficult to come up with a strategy. Because if we come out with a strategy, we'll have to have two options, one with a wind farm and one without.
We'll jump straight to the water strategy and to PFAS. Minister, it's already been mentioned in this panel, the importance of a water strategy, so would you be able to provide an update as to how the development of that strategy is going?
Yeah, I think it's publicly known, and I've certainly said it a few times, and I continue to say the water strategy was my number one priority when I came in as Minister. It's clear that by the middle of the next decade and thereafter, we may, if the population continues, well, it goes in the direction we hope it will do, we may well have some challenging to have enough water resource on the island to do everything we want to do, and I felt it was incumbent upon me to prioritise that work. The reason I say that is that if, and it is a big if, but if we decided we need additional resource in the way of reservoirs, whether that's adding to an existing reservoir or a new reservoir in order to meet this demand, I am conscious that it's a 10, 15, 20 year lead-in time to get that done. If a reservoir was the way we decided to go, and 2035, 2040 is where we need to have it ready, we need to start now. That work needs to be in train. It may well be that we do the work and find actually the reservoir option is not where we're going. We're going for water recycling, we're going for desalination, we're going for something else. That will allow us a much shorter time period to get to where we need to be, but we need that decision about reservoir made one way or the other, which is why the strategy work was so important. I've had to accept that getting everything done in the way of the water strategy between now and the next election is not going to be quite as possible as I would like. I'm coming up with a plan for a plan. I'm going to identify all the various little streams of work which are going to need to be done to inform the strategy. But I'm still going to, my intention is still, a bit like the wind farm debate, my intention is to come to a decision on the fundamentals resource that we will need moving forward before the end of this session of government. I won't have a full strategy in place. I just don't think I'm going to have time to do all those many different pieces of work, because I'd like to look at flood alleviation, I'd like to look at rainwater mixing with drains, I'd like to look at recycling, all sorts of stuff. But I'm not going to get all that done, but I will get the decision made on resource of water into the future, and I will get a plan for a plan in place before the next election.
Are there those are topic areas that are clearly could form part of a water strategy? Are they captured in a scoping document or terms of reference? And if so, could they be shared with the panel?
Would you like me to help?
Well, you could, yeah. I mean, this is hot off the press news, really, which is why you don't know about it yet.
I'm just catching up. No, so absolutely, the team are beginning to do the work on the development of the strategy. We're just working up those scope documents, actually, because we've just been re-looking at our resources, but we would be very happy with the Minister's permission to share as soon as we're able to.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it's worth mentioning that along with the development of the strategy, there's a lot of actual work still going on water, and water quality and water safety, as of course you would imagine. So there's again, we're just recutting our project resources, whereby my team are utterly focused on the development of the strategy, and we can talk to you about that in due course. And Kelly's team are doing a lot of work and managing some of the operational issues on water. So I don't know if it's helpful for you to hear about those now, or you'd rather not, because we're running short of time. But that's kind of the way we're running the two strands of work at the moment, if that's helpful.
That's great. That's brilliant. We'll follow up, I think, on the detailed matters. But one area you touched on was regulation and operational. And the panel note, of course, Minister, you signed, I think, on the 2nd of August, a dispensation for Jersey Water on nitrate levels, which is key to water quality. And the brief question from the panel would be to hear, what did you weigh up in approving that? And how did the conversation go with the Health Minister that was required under Article 19(1)? What feedback did you receive from the Health Minister on approving this kind of...
Okay, so I was faced with a decision, a request from Jersey Water to sign a dispensation, as we have signed in the past. And I had, obviously, it's a clear choice. Do I sign or do I not sign? Do I allow them a dispensation which may, for some extraordinary reason in the future, mean that we have nitrates in our water above the level that we say? And I looked at the information in front of me and the fact that Jersey Water haven't exceeded that level for a very long period of time now. And I am comfortable that whether I sign the dispensation or not, they will continue to be in that vein. The quality of water that they put into the mains as regards nitrates is well below the level that we set. And I felt, therefore, that signing the dispensation was actually okay. Some people will say, well, okay, they haven't exceeded this level for X number of years, why do they need a dispensation? I think we need to accept that there may be, at some point in their future, an extraordinary circumstance whereby the level of nitrate in the water is just a smidge above or a little bit above where they'd like it to be. But there will be extraordinary circumstances for that. And if I hadn't signed the dispensation and those circumstances occurred, they would be coming back to me and saying, Minister, tomorrow we've got two options. Either we break the law or we turn off the public water supply. Now, I know that there are recommendations in the nitrate world, if you like, that says nitrates can have effect on health. I feel that the science behind that is, that's right, it's a blue baby syndrome. The number of people who have children, babies who have been affected very clearly by nitrates is very, very small, and it has occurred in very, very few places, but in extraordinary circumstances where massive levels of nitrates have been ingested. So I am satisfied myself that, you know, a small exceedance over that level would not have a detrimental effect on health.
Okay.
And on the basis that the company have been so good over the last few years, working with, you know, let's give praise where praise is due. Everybody involved in water going into the reservoirs has worked hard in the last 10, 12 years. The Action for Cleaner Water group involving the farmers and all others have come up with some really, really good results. The levels of nitrates in our drinking water have reduced, they continue to reduce, and I don't see it as a threat. And I was happy to sign the derogation on that basis.
And we note it was only to provide that no regulatory sample shall exceed 55 milligrams a litre and no more than 10% of regulatory samples shall exceed 50 milligrams a litre. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and I know we will follow up a lot on a number of questions that we have around the water strategy, noting that you are also just hot off the press in some of those elements as well. So turning over to a different topic, Conatab, around
Yes.
planning.
Planning service reforms, and you recall that as recently as last week, Minister, you reiterated that you are fully committed to delivering real change and reform to the planning service. We're obviously aware you already published supplementary planning guidance. Can you outline any further policies or change you'll put in place to deliver change?
Well, you will know, Constable, and others will all be aware that we have an item plan with policies in it. And the only time we can change policy is when we have another item plan debate. What I do have is the ability to issue supplementary planning guidance, but that guidance can never change the direction of travel of a policy. All it can do is add detail. And while I have the ability to guide people through a policy and maybe err a little bit to one side or the other, what I cannot do is change the policy itself without going back to the Assembly. Supplementary planning guidance I've issued very recently on greenhouses, and I know some people were disappointed by that because they felt
I have a couple of questions later on that.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I'm trying to think where other supplementary planning guidance I intend to change. I'm introducing an additional paragraph into the supplementary planning guidance on historic windows, which I hope will help some people who have listed buildings with old plastic windows in them when they come to replace it. When we replace those
With
windows.
old plastic windows, with old glass windows?
Well, at the moment, the policy says that if you have old plastic windows in a listed building and you're seeking to replace them, you will replace them with wooden windows. But what I have come out with is a paragraph which introduces the concept of betterment. And what I've done is come to a point where rather than have old, horrible-looking plastic windows or new wooden windows, we can find that there may be circumstances where a window that looks like wood but isn't wood could be acceptable.
That's music to various people's ears, I'm sure.
Well, I hope it is. I've worked very hard with the team on this, and I thank them for their work on it. But the concept of betterment is something which I wanted to do. It will make the property look better, more like it should look, but it won't introduce the cost of the wooden replacement. So that's one piece of work that we're very close to issuing. And I've also been looking at some guidance which came out of the last government around 3,000 square foot on properties and the restrictions which were put in there. And I'm looking at whether that policy might be changed as well. Again,
Okay, that's helpful.
That's
Thank you.
guidance.
On to the more general question of average time to validate new planning applications. I think you advised that this would drop from 10 to 2 weeks, is that right? Due to improvements made to the system by planning officers. Can you elaborate on what improvements were made?
Well, yeah, when I became minister, there were a number of things which were put in front of me, and I was keen to get into the department, talk to officers, and Kelly's team have responded magnificently to the challenge I put in front of them, which was to let's get out, talk to people, see where they think there can be improvement. Let's see what we can do to help people through this planning process. And one of the areas that you quite rightly identified is that when applications are received into the department, they need to be validated. That was taking a period of time, and the average was around 10 weeks at the time. We have now, through just sheer hard work and determination, reduced that down to about a fortnight.
Yeah.
And we're very proud. That's just one part of the work we're really proud of that we've done in the planning department. We're trying our level best to increase our performance, which would be to the benefit not only of ourselves but to everybody else. And the first thing that happens, as I said, applications come in. The quicker we can get them validated, the quicker the officers in the department can start to determine them. I don't know if you want to say any more, Kelly. You're in charge.
Thank you, Minister. I would just say that the improvements have been additional resources, but also improving communication with our agents and customers in the requirements for validation. We've introduced a validation matrix, which we are going to continuously improve, and it's about our customers knowing what information is required as they submit their planning application. We are always seeking to improve, and we'd like to see that 2 weeks come down even further. But as you know, the aspects of validating an application is a waiting time for the customer as well as on the department, so waiting for fees and owner signatures and things like that. So there's always going to be sort of a conversation between customers and the planning department.
Okay, so I note it's the improvements through better communication, but has it also involved recruitment of more staff or engagement of more staff in the process?
So it's not required more recruitment, it's the same number of staff, but it's also about training our existing staff. So the staff that we do have on validation have been with us now for a longer period of time, and they're doing, we're doing an excellent training programme, and they're doing an amazing job.
Okay, thank you for that.
And Kelly mentioned talking to people, and one thing I've tried, I like talking to people. I find it's a good way of resolving. And in every part of the department, we're now trying harder to talk to people. So we're talking to the agents, talking to the people who submit these applications to say, look, just have a chat through rather than emails or tick boxes or chat. Have we got all the things we need? Have you got the check, or have you transferred the money? And just talking through the problems and finding ways to get around them. And that's how one of the reasons we're improving performance.
Okay, another question on this generally. The planning industry partnership board is in being. When will it publish its first report?
Well, that's a good question. The one Kelly might know the answer that I don't, but before she gives you the answer, I would say that actually it's worked really well. I've had an enormous amount of positive feedback from members of the industry, from across the industry, because all sections are represented on this board. The idea that we were going to sit down on a quarterly basis, I attended the most recent meeting. We feel it's working that well. We actually might increase the frequency of the meetings in the immediate short term to get over the additional, are there any things that we need to sort out? Where can we have discussions? But when's the first report going to come back, Kelly?
It is going to be discussed at the next board meeting in November, but we felt that potentially an annual situation would be appropriate. I agree with the Minister's comments. The feedback we've had from industry has been incredibly positive for the establishment of that industry partnership board.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, we have these meetings. As I say, we have a real good cross-section of the industry that attend. Challenges are thrown at the department, and we go away and see where we can make improvements. And we hope, quite often we're coming back and saying, well, we could do this, and we find this two-way dialogue is working really well.
Right. Given the planning reforms or the improvement situation which you've outlined, which should make these situations easier for the industry as a whole, I mean, how does that actually square with the fact that another construction company has just recently gone out of business? Are the two connected?
I don't think so. Certainly everybody likes to have a pop at planning, and more, not immediately in the past, but in the not too recent past, we've had people that would sort of take aim at us and say we're the reason the slow process has contributed to...
Which is what was reported in the press, in fact.
Yes, that's unfortunate that some of that comes. Certainly in in the last few months, our performance has improved greatly. But I think we need to be clear that there are challenging times for the construction industry. Construction costs and material costs, everything seems to outstrip inflation at the moment, but the cost of building, the difficulties in finding staff, the prices, the difficulty in pricing forward is all contributing. But I'd like to think that the steps that we've taken recently in the planning department are not the reason why people are getting into difficulty. We're doing everything we can to get applications in and out of the department with a positive determination just as often as we can.
Thanks.
I would just like to add there, Minister, the quarter 3 statistics have hit 85%, the highest level since the beginning of 2023. So the approval rate was above average at 85%, and the determinations within target have overall met the target of 85%.
Okay.
And a lot of that work is down to a new survey. We're encouraging people to come into the department now for pre-application advice. Let's talk about what you want to do with you and come out with an application which is far more likely to succeed. And we're seeing the fruit of that now. As Kelly said, 85% in the last quarter. That's by far the best statistic we've had since the beginning of 2023.
Okay. Earlier in this part of the meeting, you've referred to the question of derelict greenhouses, and you referred to that in question time last week. Do you believe there's an additional educational piece of work to undertake in respect of derelict greenhouses?
Possibly. Derelict greenhouses are a challenge, and it's challenging seeing green fields built on when we have greenhouse sites which are derelict or dangerous. But the island plan is very clear, and there's policies in the island plan which allow the development or not of derelict greenhouse sites. And if people feel that they haven't been rezoned through an island plan debate, but they feel they want to do something with those sites, there is a process to follow, there are policies to follow, and I think that has been challenging. It may well be that at the next island plan debate, politicians feel that these sites need to be used better or more or differently, and it will be incumbent upon either the department to come forward with some proposals that indicate that change of direction, or more likely, backbenchers to come forward with amendments to the island plan which get debated in the Assembly.
Before then, maybe Ms Herbert, did you not suggest in your replies to questions last week that you consider conducting an audit as to the number of derelict greenhouses there were and have that published?
I have spoken to officers about this, and we're certainly going to do initially a desktop study, which is the simplest and quickest, easiest way. I don't want to commit officers to doing large pieces of work which take them away from our priority list, but there's certainly a way of identifying these sites, which we will do. We know that the number of greenhouse sites adjacent to the built-up inn or adjacent to the built-up area is quite few. Over the years, some have been developed, and every time we develop one closer or in the built-up area, that means that the ones that are left are out in the countryside, remote, away from services, away from bus stops, shops, schools. And it is a challenge, but there are policies. The policies in the plan do allow for the redevelopment of greenhouse sites, but they don't, applicants are only going to get the bare minimum that's going to allow them to afford to put the rest of the site back into agriculture, back into amenity space. Because unless they're rezoned through an island plan debate for housing, the policy does not allow for wholesale housing to be built on derelict greenhouse sites.
Doesn't allow for wholesale, but the wording is in exceptional circumstances, and that should be the key.
Well, in exceptional circumstances, an applicant may come back and say, I've got a 10 verge or whatever it is, and I want to build 2 small houses in the corner of the field. That will allow the income I generate through building and selling those houses will allow me to take down all the existing greenhouses. I will have some income from the sale of the aluminium bits and pieces, but I will also have enough money to re-landscape, put it back into agriculture or put it back into green open space. But what the policy does not allow for is a huge profit to be made from the redevelopment of a derelict, dangerous greenhouse site outside of a planning or a housing rezoning. I don't know if I may not be explaining it very well, Kevin. You're the expert. No. But if you want to redevelop the whole of your glasshouse site, it's got to have to go through an island plan debate where that site is rezoned in its
Except for a
entirety.
whole site, but we go back to the definition of exceptional circumstances here, and you already indicated that if someone wants to develop a small part of a site, which will be the benefit of the community.
Well, Kevin will know the policy off by heart, I'm sure. I don't, but my recollection is that...
Is there such a policy, or is it not down to the planning committee itself to authorise
Well, the
that?
planning committee can go against policy if they decide they wish to on any particular application. They might put themselves open to a challenge or an appeal or something like that. But the whole reason for having a planning committee is where you have a very, very finely balanced application. They may decide to go against what the officer recommendation may be, and they do that.
Okay. Before I hand to the chair.
But Kevin, can you just...
Yeah, perhaps, I think the Minister's explained it, but it's perhaps just worth looking at the wider context. As the Minister said, the glasshouse industry, the demise of the glasshouse industry at the in the 2000s meant that there was a relatively large amount of glass in the island. A lot of that glass has now been redeveloped to provide housing. So, Samray nurseries, Dalamar nurseries, they've now got houses on them. The sites that are left are more challenging in planning terms because the spatial strategy of the plan is to focus development in the built-up areas. Where glass is left, it tends to be more remote, as the Minister has said. We did assess a number of glasshouse sites through the Island Plan review process, but it was considered in planning terms that the rezoned housing sites that have come forward were better located in planning terms than the glasshouse sites. And so we have the position that we have, where there is a policy in the plan that is very clear. There's a general presumption against the redevelopment of remaining glasshouse sites. But as the Minister has said, in exceptional circumstances, there may be circumstances where a decision could be made to allow a limited amount of development to secure the clearance of the site and the restoration of as much as possible to agriculture or alternative sort of environmentally beneficial uses.
That clarifies it. That's
the
an area battleground.
And the guidance that the Minister has published talks about how you assess those exceptional circumstances. So, the purpose of the Minister issuing that guidance is to help decision makers, be that planning officers or planning committee, interpret those proposals that might come forward for the redevelopment of glasshouse sites.
That's helpful. I'll leave it there.
as
Hand it back
the
to the chair.
Minister-
I think one of the challenges with the glasshouse SPG, and I wasn't there so I don't know, but I think certainly some glasshouse owners got the feeling that reviewing the SPG or issuing an SPG on the glasshouse policy was going to change the policy in a way which would allow them to do all sorts of things. And unfortunately, that could never be the case because SPGs cannot change the policy.
Thank you, Minister. And we have 10 minutes left, and there are three kind of big areas that the panel would like to look at. So, if you allow me, I'm going to just focus on a few things, but we'll be sending you a letter to follow up. And on the rented dwelling licence scheme. Of course, it would be interesting to hear about the statistics that have happened and how many inspections, but really from you, when can you tell us, when can we expect a first report to be published on the kind of statistical report on finding out, how many licences have been, how many inspections have been taken place, etc., so that we have that understanding?
Okay, well, I don't know if a report is planned. Kelly will tell us in a second, but we know that we're now over 17,500 applications and licences have been issued. I think it's common knowledge that we thought it might be around 15,000 when we started the process. So we've identified 2,500 properties, rented dwellings that we potentially didn't know about, although of course we didn't know what we didn't know, but we thought it might be 15,000 to 17,500. We know just over a third of those are social housing. We're still processing things like the refunds on RentSafe and stuff like that. We're still working very hard with the Jersey Landlords Association about developing the living document, and we're going to continue to call it a living document, the COP and the toolkit. We're going to continue to develop that. And I have to say, I thank them for their input, and we've had some really positive discussions with the Landlords Association about developing the code of practice. That's gone really well. We will continue to do that. Inspections have only just started. We have done in fact, it's single figures.
And in that, as you've mentioned about the social housing, I mean, is there a lot since August, the deadline for August? And then, of course, after August, there was every house, every property that was then licensed after that would have to be inspected. How many have been?
They didn't have to be inspected. They might have to be inspected. But I'll let Kelly explain the question. The answers to the questions around the social housing providers who were registered by the 1st of August got very confusing because of, a bit like planning applications having to be validated. Putting an application in for a rented dwelling until the money was paid, and it couldn't be registered. We've had some stats in the department which have been running all the way through. These are the numbers we've applied. This is one in the system at the moment. These have been paid. These are actually licences that have been issued. It's different numbers. But Kelly, can you just explain where we were with those social housing providers on the 1st of August and why there was that potential for a bit of confusion?
Absolutely, thank you, Minister. In August, we received, essentially it was the situation we had with our IT system, so we held back a lot of different types of providers, not just social housing, to when we had the bulk upload facility. So within August, we processed over sort of 8,500 licenses just in that month. So obviously questions coming pre-August, and then to the end it was a substantially different situation. In September, which was after the transitional period, we've had about 250 applications submitted or licenses issued. We have done some proactive inspections on them, and one of those has a conditional license issued. But as we can see, the majority of that 17,500 has happened within the transitional period.
Thank you. And I think one of the and it would be interesting, sorry, Minister, with the report, will there be reports regularly?
There was a commitment, I think the Minister gave to report by the end of the year.
Okay, thank you, and we'll look forward to that. And one of the, just one last thing on this, and we'll follow up in a letter, is that, of course, we're talking about the code of practice and that difficulty during inspections of applying the guidance and understanding that guidance. And how are you ensuring that officers take a consistent approach when going to inspect properties, and how can they take that consistent approach? What kind of training are they doing?
Well, Kelly will give you the detail, but the way that we get to a consistent approach is that every one of our officers is trained and qualified to a particular standard, and they can't go out and do the work unless they are of that standard, and that in itself means that they use protocols and whatever to calculate or to assess, to come out with a decision on any rented dwelling, Kelly, and hazards.
Absolutely, and as the Code of Practice explains exactly how an inspector would be going out into, to undertake the inspections and the standards of assessment that they would use. Obviously as well, it's not just reliant on a single inspector at that point in time, and there's a review process of senior officers and managers back in the office as well before any significant, decisions are made.
Thank you. Actually, that was my second question about that. So there is this kind of escalation if there is something to be seen and concern from an officer about a hazard, potential hazard, there is a process to go through.
The initial inspection of an officer would obviously take photographs and evidence and make notes, and then they'll take that away. And then, any further action by the department will be done at a later time in writing. So there's the opportunity to have officers review what was seen and evidenced in an inspection. The inspection isn't the point then of making judgments, essentially.
No, thank you very much, and we'll follow up definitely with some more questions. But lastly, turning to the food law, Minister, you said last week, in fact, in the state sitting, that you're keen to progress the legislation. However, you're unable to provide a timeline to when the legislation could be brought forward. Has law drafting commenced on this piece of legislation, and when do you think it will be brought to this?
Well, law drafting hasn't commenced, and we're working really hard in the department to come up with the timelines. It's, as I said right at the outset, the labelling of a packet of something in a shop is really important, and we want to make sure we've got that right. But that particular that's just a small part of the whole food allergens piece of work, and it's important that we get it right in the first place. There's no point in making sure there's information for customers when they go into a restaurant about food allergens and find that the requirements in the kitchen haven't been properly put in place, or the chef hasn't been trained, or the paperwork to identify where the product that's going into making the food in the first place has come from, and where. I mean, Kelly, you might want to say a bit more, but we will have a timeline in the very near future for States members. I did commit to that, and I will be doing that, but at the moment we're still working on it.
Absolutely. So there is a prioritisation occurring with the law draftsman as well, and our officers, food officers, are talking to the law draftsman this week about the periods of the months in which next year we are able to take forward the law drafting time, and the allocation of law drafting time will then fit within a consultation. So at the moment, we're not sure entirely in which quarter and which month is consultation and law drafting, because we're waiting for that prioritisation exercise to occur as well. But we will have a timeline within the week for the Minister's next states.
Are you hoping that this will be in your period of office?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I am very aware from a personal, not personal, but from a family perspective, how important this issue is. I get a lot of representations on it, as you won't be surprised to hear, but I do have first-hand experience of how crucial it is that information's on the, what it says on the tin is what it does. And I'm also aware that there's a lot more to it than that. As I said, restaurants, food preparation, food buying, all that type of thing. We need to make sure that we've got every part of the process covered, so that we can't introduce allergens into food that people are buying, whether they buy it in a shop, in a cafe, in a restaurant, at a charity event.
Thank you. And finally, in the last few minutes, we touched briefly on this in the last hearing, but it was very, very brief, about your desire to set up a tree advisory board. Has this happened? Is there terms of reference, and who is on the board?
Well, I was looking at Kevin, but the tree advisory board is moving ahead. We're very pleased that we've asked National Trust, Trees for Life, Farmers Union, representative of the agricultural industry, and we are, well, and the other one I must add is His Excellency, the Governor, who I spoke to about even over the weekend, about the importance of how he and his office want to be involved as well. But we're focusing, we've got the team in place, they're starting to meet. This is the time of year when we need to think about planting trees and how we do that. We need to be thinking about putting the right tree in the right place. We're thinking about the establishment of new woods on the island. Obviously, we need to talk to the farming community about that. We're thinking about special trees, tree protection, champion trees. Kevin's working on the protection side, and we know that we have a small list. We've most recently, we're working on the protection of a big tree in Lamont Street. There's a property that the state's own that may be sold into the private sector. We want to make sure that that tree is protected before that happens. trying to think what else, but it's work in progress, and we're pleased that it's going the way it has. We don't have anything to show for it at the moment, other than lots of people who are very enthusiastic, working hard together. I don't know if you want to add anything, Kevin, but I'm very satisfied with the way it's going. We've got a lot of coordination across the island. All facets of the countryside are getting involved, and all the right people are sitting around the table talking about how we can do all that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as the Minister said, I'm specifically working on the area around the review of the tree listing process. So, clearly, given that a decision of the Assembly not to support the establishment of a new tree regulation regime, the only sort of legal tool that's available to protect trees is the listing of protected trees. So we're looking to review that system as set out in the Minister's response to the tree strategy, and we'll look to take that drafts of that work to the Minister and to the Tree Advisory Board before taking it to wider consultation. So we'll engage with those stakeholders as part of that piece of work.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister. We'll follow up in our next quarterly hearing, and I think that we've come to the 2 hours. I know it's flown by, I'm sure, Minister. But I'd like to say thank you very much to Minister, Assistant Minister, to your team for attending today. And of course, we have a number of questions we still want to follow up on, so we will be
send them over and
sending
we'll provide the answers.